Hey, before we get to today's great episode, wanted to let you know of a new exciting thing going on for the Lounge. For the first time since we started this podcast, the Lounge has entered into a partnership with a company that is aligned in how we think. Completely stop gambling. So Betttr is giving away 200 free subscriptions for life to the first 200 users from this podcast. Download Betttr, find the link in the show notes, or searching Betttr in your app store. So it's Bettr, Bettr, quit gambling. Search for that on the App Store or click into the link in the podcast show notes. So I'll see you on Betttr. And now to today's episode. Welcome into the Gambling Recovery Lounge. My name's Eric, and I'm a compulsive gambler in recovery. The date of my last bet, June 15th of 2021. Welcome back into the lounge. Been away for about a month and a half. The summer's been good and busy, but it's good to get back at it. And this is experience number 21. I'm really excited about today's interview. You know how, for those that are in recovery and you've got some time built up, you experience different things at different times, and you have these moments, whether it's with situations or people that come into your life through the recovery space and completely change the trajectory of what's going on. And my guest today is somebody who represents an extraordinary amount to me in my journey. And it happened very quickly in my first week of recovery, actually. And so I'm excited to be able to bring him in and have a great conversation today. And we're going to cover a ton of different stuff. And what's really cool about him is he likes to challenge me. And it's been one of the great parts of our growing relationship is we do not always see eye to eye about different things. And we always have a great time hashing it out. And at the end of the day, though, have built a great relationship and friendship. So with that, I bring in my friend and brother in recovery out in the great state of Maine, Jason. Welcome into the lounge. How you doing, buddy?
I am doing great, Eric. What a phenomenal intro. I was lukewarm before, like a little apprehensive about this, but now I'm all in.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to dive into a ton of stuff, but as we do with each guest, Jason's going to tell us about his recovery song and why he chose it, a little bit about that. And then, of course, if you could start, Jason, with your recovery date as well, so people understand where you're at in your journey.
Jason S., compulsive gambler, 1,715 days since I placed my last bet. That
Nice.
is January 1st, 2021.
Yeah, so coming up on 5 years this coming New
Couple,
Year's
couple,
Day. Okay.
couple more months.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to have a story about how it came to be that you happened to start on New Year. I'm sure
Yeah.
that's a good part of the story. All right, and your recovery song?
I chose Take It to the Limit by the Eagles. There are just a lot of lyrics every time I hear that song that resonate with me, that I think about recovery. There's an opening in the first stanza. There's a line, I've always been a dreamer, spent my life running around, and it's so hard to change, but the dreams I've seen lately, they keep turning out and burning out and turning out the same.
Mm.
And I just think that encapsulates my gambling life so much. I was a dreamer and it was impossible to change. But at some point, the dreams that you have, they just keep burning out and turning out and burning out the same. And I think that always speaks to me. And then there's a line later in the song when you're looking for your freedom and nobody seems to care and you can't find the door, can't find it anywhere. Still, you're coming back and running back for more. And I was that person who was looking for their freedom for 22 years. When I was a gambler, I thought freedom was a big win and getting out of debt and financial security via a big win, but I couldn't find the door. I couldn't find that freedom. And I kept running back and coming back and running back for more. And I feel like every time I hear that song, I think speaks to my experience as an addict. I think it's about a different kind of addiction than specifically gambling addiction. But for me, I think there's a commonality among all addicts if you're one of those people who looks for the similarities instead of the differences, and that speaks to my truth and my world and my story in a very profound way. You made me narrow it down to one, but I'm going to throw in a second one because,
All right, we'll
like
let you
you
have
said,
it.
I challenge you and annoy the fuck out of you, and that's what I'm going to do.
There
I'm
we
going to
go.
go with Accentuate the Positive by Johnny Mercer. I have gone from being the least positive, most misanthropic human on the planet to only seeing the positives in every scenario. The song is sort of goofy. It's a 1940s or a 1950s bop, and it sounds a little cheesy, but accentuating the positive and throwing out the negative and latching onto the affirmative is the chorus. And I do that with every situation in my life. And every time it comes on, it makes me think that the song was written for me. So
Love it. All right. So Jason's already giving us a double dose of recovery. So it's take it to the limit and accentuate the positive.
you
So
got it.
everybody check those out and see how it relates to you. Thanks for doing that. All right. So let's dive in to let the audience get to know a little bit about you and your background, just a little bit about your growing up, family situation, dynamics there, and then we'll lead into when does gambling start to become something in your life.
Yeah, I think those two things are interwoven. So I'm probably going to start getting into gambling fairly quickly. I'm from Manchester, New Hampshire. I have two siblings and had two siblings. One, my brother passed away at some point, which I'm sure we'll get into. I was born the son of a gambler. My father was, from the time he was a teenager, very into horse racing and very into sports betting. He failed out of college because of it. That and drugs. He's had multiple addiction issues, but gambling was the thing that brought him into contact with a different side of the world that probably led to the other addictions. And he was born into a very Jewish family. And yeah, just fell in with the wrong crowd. He, I think, was arrested at least on one occasion, I think maybe on multiple occasions for illegal gambling activities. I know he went to rehab for at least 30 days on one occasion. I think in some ways it led to the dissolution of his marriage to my mother. There were many problems there, but gambling and stress and lying, certainly played a role in the destruction of that relationship. I think in the way that it's played a role in many of our relationship struggles, us
And
as
and
addicts.
how old were you when you kind of were aware of what his problems were? Were you at what age, and did you really understand what was happening?
What a great question. I think for the most part, he did a pretty good job of insulating us. We lived in a nice house. We always had food on the table. We took family vacations. So, like, I don't think I ever realized that we were like broke much of the time because of his addiction. He joined a family business that was fairly successful, and had parents who were fairly successful, which insulated him from maybe some of the worst consequences that can come from addiction. And that was probably true of me later on, in my journey. But I think, when my brother and I started to get into gambling, we didn't call it addicts when we were 12 or 13 or 14. When he first found out about it, I remember one day, maybe when we were like 13 or 14, he had left the newspaper. People don't realize this who are younger than us, but we used to get the news delivered to our houses in a format that you would have to open it and read it. The internet was not really a thing. And they used to, in the sports pages, even though gambling was illegal, they used to list the lines for every game, for every sport that day.
I remember it
And
well.
I remember one day had circled all of the games that we thought we wanted to bet on, or we're gonna, that they were gonna choose for winners. But we had accidentally left it on the kitchen table. So when he came home for lunch, he found it. Was very, very angry, saying like, "You guys don't know how dangerous this is. I've gone through it. I went to rehab." I think that was probably the first time, at least in my memory banks, that I can recall being really aware of it. I know we used to play hide and seek in my house. There was this closet in the basement, and if you got into the closet and opened up like a fake panel and, got into the walls, there was like a bunch of horse racing trophies and memorabilia stuffed in there. At one
Mm.
point, he owned like a bunch of horses or co-owned a bunch of horses, and it was a bigger part of his life than I had realized because by the time I was a fully functioning teenager, he was no longer gambling. He had, gone into recovery. So, I didn't even know horses were a part of his life until much later on.
So your relationship with your dad was not one that was brought closer together because of gambling. He had already stopped by the time maybe you were even curious about it.
I think that's accurate. I don't know his exact clean date, but I think that's accurate. I think when I was younger, maybe like 3, 4, 5, 6, he might have still been in active addiction. But by the time I became really into it, I think he had fully moved into recovery.
Got it. Okay. And your brother was 2 or 3 years younger than you, if I remember right.
He was 2 years younger than me.
Okay. And then your other sibling, a little bit on that.
She's 3 years older, Amanda, mother of three. And she's never watched a sporting event willingly in her life. Like maybe when we were kids, she went to Fenway with us, but has never had any interest in gambling or sports or anything that my father and brother and I were delving into in our least happy days.
Got it. And so you said you and your brother started doing it in early teenage years, but by this point, your dad had stopped. Now, were your parents still married at this time, or the divorce had already?
They got divorced when I was 10, so I think our gambling probably started shortly after the divorce. I remember this was like in the earlier days of the internet where you needed a modem to get online. It was just starting to be this proliferation of like online poker sites and online blackjack sites.
Yeah.
And I can reflect now on how sick we were, even as like 11 or 12-year-olds, because we had one computer in the house. And we had a computer room where the only thing in there was a computer and a desk and we had somehow got signed up with this blackjack site. And I guess we got the money from like bank accounts, from doing like chores and mowing lawns and whatever it was. We would deposit money in as a team. But in the summer, we would race to wake up before each other so we could have the computer and play blackjack all day because there was only one computer in the house. So,
Mm,
like, most, I think 11 or 12 or 13-year-olds want to sleep till like 10 or 11 or
right.
noon or something. And we were like, first one of us would get up at 7 a.m. and the other person would be so disappointed when they came in the room. So the other person would wake up at 6:45 and then the other person would wake up at 6:30 and it became like a strain in our relationship because like, one person was always on the computer playing the blackjack versus and not allowing the other person to play.
Interesting. Now,
Yeah.
did you guys, as you were embarking on this gambling activity, like, did you guys understand as brothers, like, this is a thing we're getting into? Like, we have this common bond now. And were you guys bonded by other things like sports? Like, or did this kind of become what you guys were really centered around for a period of time?
Yeah, we were bonded by other things. We actually, as we went, I left New Hampshire very early. I left when I was 15. My brother was 13. I went to high school in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So we bonded over other things, definitely sports and video games, and both watching and playing sports. We had similar groups of friends. We liked similar movies and television and music. We spent a lot of time together. We were very close when we were younger. And we actually, I think both very quickly became fairly shameful of our gambling and hid the extent to which we were both gambling from each other. So it
Hmm,
is not something we bonded over in any way, shape, or form.
interesting. All right. And so what happened that brought you to Tennessee when you were 15?
When I was younger, I was a very good golfer by New Hampshire standards. So I think 2 years in a row, my freshman and sophomore year, I finished second or third in the state, in the high school championships. I had attended public school, and then for junior high and my first years of high school, I'd switched to a private school right near our house. That was sort of for like advanced academics. One of my major character defects and positives, I guess, is that other people perceive me as smart and my mind works well in some ways. All traits, I tell this to people all the time in GA. Or in the world, there's no such thing as good traits or bad traits, right? I mean, if you're smart, you're also prone to being arrogant and having hubris and being overconfident.
Mhm.
If people think of smart as a good thing, but it can be a very dangerous thing. If you're kind, which I think the world attributes, with positive connotation too, you can also be too kind and be a pushover and have other people take advantage of you or, put other people's needs first and not treat yourself. There are no such things as good traits and bad traits, is what I've come to learn in recovery.
Mm.
Everything double-sided, a little more intuitively than everybody else. I think sports sort of defined me at that age, in a different way than it did other kids. I think that school tended to be what we would call like dorkier nowadays. Like I said, it was sort of a high achieving high school. People were interested in math and reading and science. And, I wanted to talk about the Celtics or the Red Sox or the
Hmm.
Patriots. And, I don't think I ever fit in. And I remember even when I was like 13 or 14, sneaking into the computer labs and placing bets, even at that high school. So like I was already distracted gambling in addition to being sort of a loner. But I was good at golf and I decided that I had a cousin who had a connection to this school in Tennessee, where you could play golf year round and they were producing professional players and winning national championships. And, I got an interview with the school play golf. They wanted me to come down. And so I decided, to leave home and to go to Tennessee. And I think, we're talking about hubris. Like, I didn't think there would be a culture shock. Like, I just thought I could get along everywhere. And moving to the deep south when you're a northern Jew moving into the Bible Belt in the deep south was more of a culture shock than I realized. And I think I became more socially isolated. My gambling got deeper. I didn't have many friends or people I connected with. I lost my family structure. I was away from home, and the problem got
So who were
in.
you living with there?
I was living, it was a boarding school, half boarding school, half day school. My golf career didn't go as I expected. Being the second or third best player in New Hampshire does not translate well to the Deep South, where they play 12 months a year instead of 5 months a year.
Mm,
They immediately put me with this coach. I sort of had an unorthodox swing.
yeah, yeah.
Anyway, Baylor felt that, if they could make my swing more conventional, they could unlock a lot of potential. And it didn't work out. They tried to put me with a coach. I got, often when you try to change your swing in golf, you take 2 steps forward, but then it's 2 steps back, but then you go 3 steps forward. In those 2 years I was in Chattanooga, it was all going backwards and very
Mm.
forwards. And to this day, I don't know what part of it, was I was distracted by gambling and what part of it was, golf is a really hard sport. And no matter how deep into gambling I was, even in my younger years, I loved golf more than anything. I think I probably spent a lot of time on the range and working at it, but I'm sure gambling affected my career in some way, shape, or form. And being socially isolated and probably a little depressed, all sorts of things. But it didn't work out anyway.
All right, so this seems to be an interesting kind of crux of the story then. So you're isolated, you're not performing as well in golf, which is the love of your life at this point as a teenager. You're alone in this new state, you've lost connection, and you now start gambling. And I assume at this point is where the offshore online accounts start to become more prevalent. And is this where you started to dive deeper?
Yeah, yeah. I don't remember exactly how I was accessing my money. I think maybe my parents must have given me like a credit card, for like important things when I was far away in Tennessee or depositing money in a debit account. And whatever it was, like I just went wild playing these illegal, obviously back then gambling was illegal. We're talking about
Mhm.
when I was, I don't know, 16, so 17. So we're talking about
Early
like in
2000s.
the early 2000s,
Yeah, it's
2000.
exactly when I started all my online stuff. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, the
exactly. So
timeline
like
totally lines up.
I would go to like Western Union and send like money
Mhm.
orders to Nicaragua
Oh,
or
yeah.
Panama for like sportsbook.com
Yeah.
or something like that. And you would send
MoneyGrams. Did you do MoneyGrams as well?
MoneyGrams,
Oh, yeah.
exactly.
Oh, my
Yeah.
God.
And they
Lovely
would
memories.
yeah, exactly. And like I became like it's like so embarrassing. Like I would send like 4 or 5 in a day or a week, and like the people, every person at Western Union knew you, and they would think you never tell them why you were sending $800 to Managua, Nicaragua, to somebody different person's name every time. But like that's what you did. That's how you
Right.
gambled. And then it
That's
would show up.
so
Yeah,
fucking crazy.
yeah,
It feels like yesterday still for me because I remember every single one of those trips. Um,
yeah,
oh
yeah.
my God. Okay, so now you're ratcheting up the deposit. So how did you hide that stuff though from your if it was a credit card from your parent, was nobody tracking what you were doing, or you were lying to
Yeah, I
everybody?
think somehow I honestly don't remember the specific. Okay, so I know I got caught in college, very early in college. I'm wondering if in my head I make my high school binging. I definitely know that's where I started, like gambling over line, but I don't know the numbers, how bad they got.
Mhm.
I do remember in college very early on, I think what happened was because my father is very financially, post in his recovery life, very financially savvy. And he had built up our credit over time. Okay, now I remember. He had built up our credit over time. Like as kids, he would put out credit cards in our name, and then he would buy things with them and pay it off. So we had good credit. And so by the time I got to high school, I was actually able to apply for credit cards and loans without my parents knowing about it. So I had credit cards that I wasn't paying off, I was using to gamble
So cash
and
advances you were taking,
cash advances. Exactly. Yeah,
and then you'd go
exactly.
to Western Union or
Yeah.
MoneyGram or something.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So now, thank you. Yeah. See, I love having these conversations because you always remember new things. Even though I've been in recovery for, almost 5 years and I talk about it every fucking day and you remember new things all the time.
Well, because when you gamble for every day for 20 years,
Exactly.
5 years of recovery is still not holding a candle to the 20 years.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah,
100%.
I totally get it, man.
But by the time I got to college, people wanted their money. Creditors were calling all the time, and they started calling my parents, being like, "Do you know what Jason? If so, he owes us five, six, seven, eight, nine, 12,000, whatever it was." Like
Mhm.
the numbers got bigger as I got older. They ended up being five figures or six figures instead of single digits. But
Mhm.
whatever it was a lot as a high schooler to be in debt, and then
Mhm.
as a first year college student, and I was always, again, one of the downsides to being quote unquote smart and articulate. I was always able to come up with lies to explain why somebody pressured me to do it, or, and then I got into
Mhm.
deep and I wanted to win it back because I didn't want to disappoint you guys or whatever. So, for the first few times I got caught, I was always able to get bailed out because I have a silver tongue and I'm good at manipulating people and the terrible person that everybody is when they're,
So
stupid.
even your dad going through gambling addiction and then recovery, he didn't catch on to that and
I
question you
mean,
about, is this gambling? What the hell's going on here?
he eventually did, but I still think even, because he loved his son, and I don't think he wanted to think his son was an addict, he still bailed me out a couple of times and, was susceptible to my bullshit.
And kind of just turned his head because even if he had an inkling, didn't want to know.
Probably. So my parents got divorced. My dad became a single father. My sister and I moved in with my father. It was an absent father. My father went from being a gambling addict to a workaholic. For better or worse. I mean, he built turned a family company. In the last 10 years, he's become incredibly wealthy, but he was never home. And, we could gamble all day long or have parties at our house or play video games until late at night, early in the morning,
Mm,
or so this is not I'm not casting aspersions on my father who may listen to this. I love my father very much, but I don't think right after the divorce for like the 4 or 5 years I was in New Hampshire and he was in charge of us. He was well equipped to be a father. And that was probably true, his mind. Not that I wasn't a priority. I think he would always say that his children were his number one priority, but his mind was elsewhere sometimes. And so like even when I got caught, I don't think he was fully great at communicating with his children
mm,
or, like, and had other priorities. And, like his major priority was growing his company at that point.
got it. Okay, so after the high school experience in Tennessee, you go back home to New Hampshire for college.
No, I went to college in Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, just 2 hours away from Chattanooga, Tennessee, with one of my few friends from high school. He was going there again. Like, I think if I was a studious person, I probably could have gone to Columbia or MIT or Harvard or wherever, but I was a shitty student. I mean, shitty based on like what I could have been versus, like I got by despite gambling because again, I'm mildly capable, good at those things. So I went to a school called Emory University in Atlanta. It only got worse. I think at one point I was running like a Ponzi scheme on my freshman floor where I convinced everybody I was good at gambling and I convinced them to invest money with me and told them I would pay them back. And, I never had the money to pay them back. I would tell them, oh, I'm rolling it over. I'll keep winning. And I would borrow from other people to pay back the first people I took money from.
So were you
And,
booking sports bets or you were just taking their money, gambling
and
it
then
yourself? Got it.
gambling it myself. Yeah. I was never a bookie. I was never running book. I was always making bets myself, thinking I could
Got it.
use my system or my brain to outdo things. Again, the difference between smart and arrogance and smarts and hubris, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and so I got caught. I remember like the week of my wedding, it almost blew up. I went to my father and I was like, I'm like $50,000 in debt. Creditors calling me all the time. I was like, I can't. If Susan finds out about this, she's not going to go through with the marriage. Like, can you help me out? And he's like, I can't believe I'm doing this, but I don't want it
Mm.
to ruin your marriage. So again, I got like bailed out.
Let's back up
And
a second on that timeline. So you meet Susan in college?
I do. She was in a dorm near mine, and we actually met, I think, to some extent, gambling. We would play cards with the rest of our dorm
Hmm.
on Friday night, playing like Texas Hold'em or other card games. And I think she knew pretty quickly that I had a problem. Maybe I mean, again, like I'm always able to come up with stories and excuses, but I used to make her stay inside all day on Saturdays so we could watch like the games I was betting on her, and I would
Hmm.
and I would tell her I was winning, and then we would have to spend all day Sundays, and then I think like my junior year, we lived in this condo complex off campus, and one of the guys in the condo complex ran a poker game, an illegal poker game every night out of his condo. And I used to wait till Susan fell asleep at like 11 or midnight and then slip out of the bed and
Mm.
play until like 3 or 4 in the morning until I ran out of money and then slip back into bed, and I think eventually once or twice she would wake up and be like, where the fuck is my boyfriend?
Hmm.
I could never pay for things. I never had money to buy birthday gifts or Hanukkah gifts or Christmas
Hmm.
gifts. My wife is a brilliant woman. She had her shit together long before I did. So, she eventually knew, but again, like I'm certain that I conned her out of money to bail me out in certain situations, and this just continued. One time she caught me and we had to go to my parents to ask for help, and I agreed to go see a therapist, like an addiction therapist. The therapist was
She caught,
pissed.
when you say she caught you doing what?
She caught me being way more debt than I had copped to, or I had
By
confessed to
seeing something in on a bank
seeing like
statement
money
or
missing
something,
from
or
our missing money stolen from our bank accounts, or me asking her for help. I'm not 100% sure. Because I've
okay,
been caught so many times over my life, the
got it.
details sort
It
of
gets
blur
blurred.
together.
I get
Yeah.
that. I get that
Yeah.
completely. Okay.
It's
So,
hard. It's hard in a 2-hour conversation to go over all the details
yep,
because the amount of time I spent gambling and the amount of time I sought people trying to convince people who loved me to help me out, or I spent time stealing from them or conning them, or it's almost unfathomable. This is true, I know of you and true of a lot of gamblers. I don't want to make it sound like I was worse than any other gambler, but to the regular person, it's almost unfathomable the amount of times I got into trouble and kept going back to that well.
yeah, for sure. I totally get it. So you're how long were you dating before you proposed? What's the
Yeah,
timeline here?
we got married on our 5th anniversary. We're coming up on our 20th anniversary. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Um,
So you talked about as you're approaching your wedding, you tell your dad, I'm $50,000 in debt. He bails you out. Now, at this, Susan also knew about this amount of debt going into the wedding, or you were
I
keeping
don't think
that from her?
I don't think so. I think she had known on a couple of occasions before that. This happened literally like every year or every 9 months where I would
Okay.
tell people I was stopping and then I secretly was not stopping and I would have another 5,000 or 7,000. I really don't know what the number was. The wedding, maybe it was 25,000, but it was a big number. And, I was like, I don't think I went to my dad and I was like, I don't think if Susan finds out I was gambling again after I told her I would stop, I don't think she's going to go through with this wedding.
Got
So
it.
my dad bailed me out and then, I would be clean for another 9 months or a year or maybe even a year and a half. Every time the slate was wiped clean, even though I told people vocally I was going to stop, I never had any real intentions of stopping. To
Mm,
me, it was never a problem. Gambling was never a problem. It was the being like underfunded or not having the time to do all of the things I wanted, to study the amount of time I wanted. Whatever it was, I had schemes in my head and I was convinced that I was going to be a winner, that I was smart enough to beat the system.
Yeah. No, I got it. And I had those same periods of abstinence for numbers of months, thinking, okay, I'll just go back the next time and everything will be different and I'll win it all back. Even though I knew truly I was a loser. Like I
Yeah.
knew it, but I just didn't want to believe it. I mean, that's what happens when we cross that line. The delusional thinking, right, is what seeps in for all of us. Okay, so now you're married,
Yep.
and then what happens?
The same patterns keep happening, like I'm playing, we were in Ohio right after college. We were journalists for most of our lives. And the first jobs we took were as newspaper journalists in Ohio. And I would find excuses, and I can't even remember how, but to go to Detroit, which was a 2-hour drive away, to go to the nearest casino to play poker.
Mm,
I remember the Meyer grocery stores in the Midwest. Like I became like famous for the amount of Western Union, things I was still sending out there. I was juggling multiple payday loans from like the 3 or 4 payday loan places in the city. I was gambling all of the time. I was somehow, this is like one of the tragedies and underlying reasons that I got away with it for so long. I was somehow managing a fairly successful journalism career. I was 2 years in a row, I won Best Journalist in the state of Ohio from the Associated Press Best News Reporter. I would win award after award after award. And so people thought I was doing fine on the outside,
mm-hmm,
but I would spend 4 hours doing work and 14 hours gambling. And I was good enough in my whatever underlying skills I
mm-hmm,
had to get by with those 4 hours work and to fool people to think I was good at my job. But my life was falling apart. And I think basically the same patterns. Maybe I got away with it. Maybe like I had a longer lull at that point, like 2 or 3 years before people realized I was in trouble again. But somehow, I would get into trouble and then I would stay clean for long enough where, I would pay off some of my debt and then I would convince either Susan or my parents to pay off the rest of it.
mm-hmm,
And this just happened over and over and over again. And in 2011, we moved back to Maine to be closer to family. And I tell the story all the time. My brother got sick. He got sick from cancer, epithelioid sarcoma, cancer of the soft tissue. It's sort of a rare cancer. And in the 5 years he had cancer, the amount of times that I went out to Chicago to see him and then went down to Boston to see him or call him, I can count on less than two hands in the 5 years he was dying and sick because I was so consumed for those 5 years with everything, every crisis that was going on in my life. And like we were having trouble marriage wise, like because, I was irritable. We were always broke. I was gaslighting her about things. Obviously, when she's not happy with me, she doesn't want to have physical affection or sleep with me because, like who
mm-hmm.
would? Wasn't staying in shape because, I was spending all my time gambling or working. And so, like, just my life was a mess. It's like, it's hard until we have these conversations and somebody brings something up in a share to remember like specific moments. But it was just it was like Groundhog's Day if it were a horror movie instead of a comedy with Bill Murray. It's like, every day you wake up and it's one crisis after another, one lie after another, another night of no sleep, another night of no sleep, no friends, not communicating with family, lying to your wife, committing illegal acts, stealing, moving money around, avoiding creditors. It's just like, it's a death spiral is what it
Yeah.
is.
I think every compulsive gambler listening to this relates to that, and I know I certainly do. I don't want to. I don't want to gloss over it
The yada yada
because
yada to the part where I get
no,
into
no.
recovery.
I think no. The because I think it always exacerbates for all of us, and it gets worse and worse and worse, and then
Yeah.
more things become potentially more traumatizing, et cetera, and then makes other things worse and worse and worse. So this situation with your brother and this 5-year battle that he had, with cancer before he passed. You were you were how old during those? What was that 5 year period? About
My brother passed away in 2017. I think he was diagnosed in 2012. So I would have been like 26-ish when it started, and then I
got it,
was 31 maybe when he passed away.
got it. And you had mentioned him being in another state. So before he got cancer, had you guys already, let's say, grown more distant over those years just because of geography and you were off doing different things, or were you still close and keeping in touch even before he got sick?
No, we had grown distant. I was distant from everybody. It's hard to believe because I think people who know me now find me to be like very gregarious and, social and friendly. But I was just so caught up in my own world and addiction. I basically never reached out to anybody. There's a movie called Into the Wild, came out in maybe 2008. It's a true story about a young man who went to Emory, my school, and sort of travels the country as sort of an isolationist, makes, friends, and then moves on to another town. He eventually winds up in Alaska, living out of a bus in Alaska. He's sort of an adventurer and eats a poisonous plant and then dies alone out in Alaska. I told my mom to go see it, and she called me after she saw it, and I was like, "Oh, did you like it?" And she's fucking weeping in tears, and she's like, "Is this your way of telling me you're just going to completely disconnect and
Mm,
move off into the world, and the next time we hear you, the next time we hear from you, you're going to be dead. The next time
mm,
we hear about you, and that wasn't my intention, but that's the feeling I gave off to other people, was that one day I was going to disappear, and that my life was headed towards this isolationist, sort of tragic ending. Yeah, so, my brother I moved down to Tennessee to go to high school. Then I went to college in Georgia. My brother eventually went to college in Chicago. He built a life in Chicago. I built a life in Ohio and then Maine. And we just, drifted apart. I think, I don't know the specifics because I didn't get into recovery until after he died, so I never got to talk to him about the specifics. But I got glimpses that he was having his own struggles. I remember once maybe he took out like just quietly, I don't know if he told me or I found a document, but he had taken out like a 60 or an $80,000 loan from a bank. I know he was always, till the day he died, he gambled on sports, with people in our fantasy football group. They had their own bookie. I
mm.
remember like 3 weeks before he died, he was on a mask, an oxygen mask, and a friend came to visit, and he was asking if they had collected money from a bookie for bets they had placed. So like up until his dying day, he was a gambler. Awesome kid. He inspired a lot of people. He helped a lot of high school female athletes get into college. He left behind a really wonderful bride. He got married while he was fighting cancer, and this woman Amy, who's become a part of our family, is amazing. So all these amazing qualities, like all gamblers, but I think he definitely had his own demons. So we grew apart because of geography, because of addiction, and because that's what happens when people grow old often, unless they make concerted efforts. And I certainly wasn't making any, not just a concerted effort, I wasn't making any effort on my end.
Mm.
When we were together, we had a blast. We immediately connected. There was tremendous amounts of love and connection and simpatico-ness. But when we were apart, I was just a ghost.
What was his name?
Jordan.
Do you remember if there was a funeral or proceedings were, do you remember what the feeling was for you, have him having passed, and your reflection, whether it was then or more in recovery, being able to look back with clarity, what that emotional feeling was for you, given you talking about how in 5 years of his sickness, you were barely visible physically and probably even less emotionally for him.
So I'll say that I used to pride myself on the fact that I was very unemotional. I always thought if my parents died or my brother died or my wife died, I like wouldn't cry, that like, I would be fine and I would move on. And I don't, for some reason, I thought that was a good thing. But, like I would tell everybody I was sort of like an automaton or a psychopath, like, that I didn't have emotions. And I felt my brother's funeral would be the same way. But we were sitting in the front row of the synagogue, and I could not stop crying. And I was supposed to be a pallbearer. And I got up to lift up the casket and I just collapsed on the floor. Uh, I don't know. I don't know if it was because I lost the chance to be his brother or my life had just been a mess for so long, but I was basically non-functional. I think like I couldn't stop crying for the whole few hours that the funeral was going on. At the synagogue, at the cemetery, I think I sort of like hid in the back and just kept crying and shaking. Even to this day, I don't go to the cemetery. It just, yeah, it's one of the few things in life that I get really emotional over, and I really don't know why that is. I don't think I spend a lot of time exploring it, but I am brought to tears every time I think about that funeral or every time I see his gravestone, and I really struggle with it. I think I'm fast forwarding to recovery a little. In recovery, we talk about making amends to people,
Mhm.
you know, and I think I've done a very good job, or I think I've done an okay job, I should say, because I'm sure there are some people who disagree. But I've tried to make amends to everybody, who I hurt in my gambling days, and even in my post gambling days. And in recovery, I've hurt plenty of people. But he's the one person I can't make amends to, right? He's gone, and I didn't get in recovery until after he was gone. So, uh, I think I tried to live a life that I try to encompass the best of his personality and help it live on and give his life meaning. But it's a topic I struggle with, obviously. I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but it's a topic I struggle with.
It brings back for me memories of multiple people in my life that passed away while I was still an addict, not somebody as close as a brother, but close friends and other relatives. And I certainly remember going through most of that numb and a total lack of what should have been emotional support for other people. I tell the story often about my partner Edgardo's niece who passed away around that same time, 2017, 18. And like you, I didn't start recovery till 2021. And at the funeral with his entire family grieving, I stepped away to go to the bathroom to gamble. And I was unavailable, barely there physically, but totally unavailable emotionally. And so I can completely, in a similar kind of way, very much relate to what you're talking about. I think the amends stuff. Offline. I want to have a conversation with you about what maybe opportunities you can go through, because I've done this a little bit myself with how to address that for somebody who's passed away that we feel like we do owe amends to. But thank you, Jason, for being so open and honest about all that. We're going to
I'll just
break.
say quickly, I know
Yeah,
we're going to take a break. Let me just say
yeah,
quickly also, like, I'm talking about being an emotional wreck and talking about myself with his funeral. My parents had to bury their child, and I wasn't there at all for them. And years went by before I was there for them emotionally. So it's like, we talk about this in recovery all the time, but one, we make things always about ourselves. And then two, it's not just they talk about victimless crimes. This is like the most of victimville crime. We often think like, why don't these people leave us alone? I'm just destroying my own life. But the pain and suffering that you cause radiates out in a ripple or a tidal wave in some cases to other people's lives and ponds and serenity. So,
yeah,
okay, I'll stop
no
talking now.
question. Yeah, I think that's like the number one crime we all commit as addicts is we rob the people that we love the most of their ability to live their lives free. And I think in recovery, that's the way to make a living amends, which is all that we can do, and change the direction of what we do going forward compared to the people we became as addicts. So that's the way I like to look at that. We'll take a break there, and we'll be back in the Gambling Recovery Lounge. All right, welcome back into the Gambling Recovery Lounge. All right, so let's pick up, Jason, with the part of the story where you're now married, the gambling is starting to escalate, you're continuing to lie, So what then starts to happen thereafter?
Yeah, I'll skip forward a little until to the incident that got me into recovery.
Great.
So, my wife had gone through at that point 15 years of Jason and gambling. And I had on occasion I often did this thing where I would pretend to try to get clean by going to AA meetings. There weren't GA meetings here in Maine at the time. There was one GA meeting, I should say, that once a week that I went to. It was all maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago. It was at a hospital here. I went, it was six people in their 70s or 80s and me, and I assumed they weren't like me. I stayed for one meeting. I didn't feel comfortable there. And most importantly, I didn't have any interest in stopping gambling, I don't think. And so I never went back. I would occasionally, when I was trying to show people I was trying to change my ways, I would attend AA meetings because those are very frequent here in Maine, like they're everywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
There's 17 of them a day in the city, but I always felt uncomfortable there. I've never had a sip of alcohol in my life. I've never tried alcohol. I've never tried drugs. At least in Maine, often the AA meetings and the NA meetings are very different socioeconomically than the gambling meetings that I've attended historically. And so, I always looked for differences instead of similarities. I always found reasons. I'm Jewish. I was raised Jewish, but I'm an atheist spiritually. Every time you step into a 12-step room, there are people talking about God and a higher
Mm-hmm.
power. And so, I used religiosity, I used differences as a reason to stay away when in actuality I really just didn't want to change, right?
Right.
The winter of 2021, I had rung up so much debt and I was so tired of it. I had come to the end of my wits and I was like, I am giving up gambling. But I didn't have a way to explain the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars I was in debt and didn't have any interest in disclosing that to anybody because I knew the consequences were very dire. And so I continued to not pay bills and tell my wife I was paying them, gaslight her about paychecks that went missing or money that went missing. She found out right around New Year's or a little after New Year's that, I had been gambling and I had all this debt.
Mm.
And my wife is in the military, is in the army. She was headed out to Arizona for a 1 month military assignment. And she said, when I get back, I'm moving out, our marriage is over.
Mm.
And so when she was gone, and before that, she wanted me out of the house. She didn't care where I went, to stay with my parents or to find whatever. It wasn't important to her at that time because I had caused enough damage and stress over
Mm-hmm.
15 years.
Right.
And so I didn't want to go. I could have gone to New Hampshire, but I would have had to tell my parents that my marriage was falling apart and it was falling apart because I was gambling again. So I didn't do that. So I decided to sleep in my car in the Maine winter
Mm.
and be homeless. I thought that was a better option than coming clean to people and to getting into recovery. And so I was sleeping in my car in the Maine winter. Like when my Susan would left, I might try to sneak in and get a change of clothes or shower. If she was there, I would, I still belonged at a gym near us, 24-hour gym, and I would shower or change there. I guess this was winter. There was times where I was sleeping in my car and I was so fucked up that I was sleeping in front of a casino so I could go
Mm.
gamble again. At that point in winter of 2021, I had decided that I wasn't going to gamble again, or at least that I was done gambling for a while because I couldn't get into any further debt. When she was gone, I decided to start going to GA meetings online. I found out that there were Gamblers Anonymous meetings online. And I think I still wasn't convinced that I was going to stop, that I was looking for some sort of handout, but I definitely didn't want her to leave me. The main reason I started going to recovery was I wanted us to say, I'm actively working on myself. There's
Did
no
she
need.
say if you do this or I see some effort, then maybe
She
you
had
got?
said that in the past, but this was like the 17,000th chance she had given me. She
Yeah.
said she was, moving out when she
Is
returned.
the
And but me, who thinks they can fix everything,
right.
who can manipulate any situation, was
Right.
like, I'll start going to recovery and at least I can tell her when she calls, if she calls, from Arizona, that, hey, I just wanted to let you know I started going to meetings. And, if I do that consistently while she's gone for the month or 6 weeks or 2 months, however long she was going to be gone, maybe I can convince her at least to let me back in the house, even if she wasn't going to commit to staying, long term, like at
Right.
least show some budge. But I didn't have like any real interest in getting help. I still didn't believe in 12-step programs. And so I started attending various meetings out of California, because they were at the end of my day. Like I could work. I was, in addition to working as a real estate agent, I had moved from journalism to real estate, which is a
Mhm.
different story. But I was like driving Uber to
Mhm.
pay, one, to hand out real estate cards, but two, most importantly, to come up with little bits of money to
Mhm.
pay off whatever creditors I had, and even before that, to fund my gambling. So I was like doing a double dipping my jobs,
Mhm.
because every dollar I got when I was gambling went
Right.
sixfold into gambling. And so, but at the end of the days, I could jump on a California meeting. There were like a handful every night at that
Mhm.
time. And I stumbled into one that you know well called Burbank. And I finished the meeting at 11:30 p.m. Eastern. And there were only like 5 or 6 people in the meeting, some of whom have become fairly big wigs in the California recovery scene. So, but I went to that one meeting. I had no intention of going back. I didn't want to make connections with people. I, wanted to be able, I don't think I really wanted to share at that time, but because there was a room of 5 or 6 people, I had to share the night I was there. Somebody else had posted their number on the screen, so I posted my number on the screen. It said like Jason S 603. So anyway, I had started doing that, whatever meeting I went to. And so I went to bed, and the next morning I woke up and I got a call, and he was like, "Hey, I just want to let you know I really enjoyed your share at the meeting last night. Your story resonated a lot with me. I hope you come back tonight." And I said, "Yeah, I really appreciate the call. I'll definitely be there." Hung up, no intention of going back that night. Okay.
Mm.
That was at like, I don't know, 9, 10 a.m. It was very early Los Angeles time, by the way, his
Right.
time. And then 3 o'clock rolls around, and Guy is calling again. He says, like, just checking in. I know you've got a few weeks or months away from gambling, but I just want to make sure that you're okay and that you're still coming back tonight, and just checking in. And I was like, oh, this is crazy. Thanks for calling again. Yeah, I'm doing well. I have no intentions on gambling, and yeah, I'll be back tonight. Again, I had no intention of going back.
Right.
9:55 p.m. rolls around. Looking for like a different meeting to attend so I can tell my wife that I attended a meeting. Guy calls and says, "Hey, the meeting's starting in 5 minutes. I'm jumping on right now. How about you jump on while I'm on the phone with you, and
Wow.
we can attend the meeting
Persistence.
together." I did. So I went back for the second night, and he did that for like 10, 14, 15, 20 days. Every day he would call me multiple times a day,
No.
say like, "I really enjoyed your share last night. Here's a little bit about me. Tell me a little bit about you. Just want to make sure you're coming back tonight." So he like almost twisted my arm to like a 30 days in a row while my wife was gone, attending his meeting. And then it was a small meeting. For whatever reason, they needed somebody to host one night. They were like, "Jason's articulate and, has been here like 3 weeks in a row. Jason, will you host tomorrow night?" And I was like, "I guess, sure."
I have not
So I,
heard this story. This is amazing. Okay, great.
yeah,
Great.
so like I've got 3 weeks in, I'm hosting a meeting, and then my life just sort of slowly started to get better. I never really made the decision to never go back to gambling again, but like, you spend 3 or 4 days not gambling. And before, I think one of the reasons that I became homeless was because my wife had found out about all my debt. So I had no longer had pressure to by ill-gotten means pay it off. My secret was out, okay?
Hmm.
I was able to go to bed and honestly tell my wife I hadn't gambled, and like I think she knew most of my debts. I don't think she knew all of them, but I think she knew most of them. And I started sleeping better because I wasn't spending all night watching games or like studying. It was nice to get positive feedback from the people in the room that I was doing something right. They would always say like, "Oh, your share really helps me." They were a very supportive group, even though it was fairly small. And then when they put me in charge, it ended up like very quickly. I was running the meeting like 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And then like I felt almost like peer pressure to not gamble and jump more into the program,
Mm.
because I didn't want somebody walking in and, me having to say I was back on day one and I was in charge. Like, like there's some responsibility when newcomers jump in. And I met a guy there who ended up being my first sponsor. And then when I started taking over, running it more nights, it started to grow. Like, we started at 5 or 6, and then it was 9 or 10, and then it was 15 or 16. And I think by like my 3 month mark, we were regularly getting like 25 or 27 people. And so by the time my wife came home, I was running meetings and people were calling me for advice.
So
And
what? How much time did you have when she got back home? Was that 90 days or so when she came back?
like it was like 6 weeks, I think. I'm not
Okay,
sure.
okay, got it.
Like, okay,
First
so I
couple months.
actually I actually don't do it correctly by GA standards because I gave up gambling in October, November. That first meeting, I've since heard this is not correct, but that first meeting, somebody was like, "How about we just use January 1st as your?" I think it was out of a San Diego meeting as your thing because that'll be easy to count from.
So wait,
And
you actually have more clean time than January 1st? It's further back
But
or
I think most GA people count it from their first meeting. So I
yeah.
actually have less clean time than I should.
Yeah, so
I
the
have, I have more clean
I'm
time
gonna
to track.
all right, I have to give you a little GA like gospel here. So the
Yeah,
official, and this isn't Eric, this is
yeah,
truly the way it's stated in the GA guidance code. So
yeah.
it's your first meeting after your last bet.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
All
exactly.
right.
So like I have more clean time than my first date, but my first meeting didn't come until like I think February, even
Okay,
though I used January 1st as my back date and my
got it.
actual gambling stopped in like October, November.
Got it. It's
Um,
hey, at this point, I say stick with what you got.
yeah,
Because
exactly.
you're not
Yeah.
going to remember the first
I
February
don't know.
meeting
Yeah,
anyway,
exactly.
right?
Yeah,
All right.
exactly. Exactly.
We'll keep you in the fellowship. It's okay.
Well, exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, like, so still many problems, still cheating on all sorts of things. But anyway, my wife got back, when like I was suddenly hosting meetings and people were calling for advice, and I was openly talking about gambling for the first time in my life,
Mm,
talking about the things I had done. She would go into the bedroom when I was running meetings, but I'm pretty sure she could hear me sharing. I'm sure I used it somewhat manipulatively, but I would talk about like all the pain that I caused, and all of the destruction I had wrought and all of, confessing all of my sins. But it was progress in that I was talking about it for the first time and that I was abstaining.
So when she got back, she didn't say, "Why the hell are you still here? Get out." There was this period
I
where she
think
kind of
she was like, you can stay here for a couple more nights. And then I was like hosting the meetings.
got
And
it.
I don't remember specifically, but for whatever reason, she like put off plans to move out immediately. Like it might be a couple of weeks. And
Okay,
then a couple of weeks turned into a couple of months. And
got it.
then, here we are 20, 5 years later, 4.5 years
Amazing.
later.
All right, so
Um,
you're hosting meetings more. She's
yeah.
hearing that. She's seeing some
You know,
positive changes.
Yeah, exactly. And then when I got to like maybe 90 days, I told my parents what was going on and
Mm,
that I was in recovery and that I was running meetings. And if they wanted to come to the meetings, I would love to have them,
yep.
to hear more about my story, and life just sort of got better. Like I got better at my job. Money, I never went through a pressure relief, but like the money part really does, even if you have debt and I had so much debt, but like you can start paying, you can call your creditors and get on a payment plan and you can start paying it back and living a normal life. Even with debt, you can live a normal life and
Right.
still go out to eat and whatever as long as you're successful in your job.
Cool.
And I started having friends in the GA program, you and many others. Like I would go out to Los Angeles. I don't know, remember the first time I went out to Los Angeles, if it was at like the 6 month mark or the 9 month mark, but like I was meeting people. There was people who would that Burbank meeting attracted people from all over the country. So I suddenly had friends who were gamblers in Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York, who we would go like see on road trips, and life just got better. It like it gets better really quickly. It doesn't mean that all your problems are solved, but it got better really quickly. Over time, I think, I was not like a super program person when I was first in there, which is something I think that you and I had a little bit of tension over.
Hmm.
I ran meetings my own way.
Hmm.
I ran them like they were comment meetings where I was very supportive to other people and, would be sort of like a cheerleader and give them comments back. But it felt like even though I was not 100% doing things by the book, I was impacting other people's lives for the first time in a positive way. Our meeting grew to 50, 60, sometimes 70 people a night. More than GA, recovery became a major part of my life. Every time I met somebody and I meet somebody nowadays, within 15 minutes, they know I'm an addict.
Hmm.
It's internally become a huge part of my story. And it's one of those things like people think of it when they walk into meetings, they think of being an addict as a very shameful thing. They have tons of shame. They're scared for the outside world to know.
Right.
And it's one of those things, and I don't know if it happens at the 3 month mark or 6 month mark or 9 month mark, but when an addict, being a recovering addict becomes an integral part of your personality and your story, and you're telling people about it, and you're telling people everybody has problems. There are people who work on them and don't. Some people call them addictions, some people don't. People are calling you for advice on the phone. You're running meetings, you're being of service. Like it suddenly becomes a really admirable thing because there are two kinds of people in the world, people who have problems and people who are lying about having problems, right? But the happiest, most successful people are the people you want to be friends with and surround yourself with are the
Yeah,
people who are actively working on themselves.
for
So
sure.
like, when if you're in recovery and you're buying it and you're actively working on yourself, like that becomes a very attractive, interesting, responsible, unique adult quality to you. And so like, it becomes from being a shameful thing to like a really cool part of your personality. You're somebody who went through adversity and turned it into a positive and found a way to overcome those obstacles. It speaks to resilience and, the possibility that's in all of us and the human spirit, no matter how bad you were. And
Yeah, for
so
sure. I heard something on that note recently. There was a podcast I was listening to, and it was with a guy who was a pastor and became really famous. And I think he was in New York, and he ended up doing some despicable things, and also ended up with I think it was drug addiction, and he was now in recovery for a while. And the interviewer asked him, "How did you know when your life was getting a lot better and recovery was really taking hold?" And he said something which lines up right to what you were saying. He said, "When I knew that the thing that was the worst thing that ever happened to me in my life, that I was starting to take from it more than it took from me, that's when I knew my life was getting great." And I think that's exactly what you were talking about. And that's how I view it too. I mean, I lost so much to gambling in my life for so long, but now what I do and how I live my life in recovery and all the things I have because of it, I know for sure now, in a way, it's the best thing that ever happened to me, because all the things that are happening for me now and all the people that I've met, like you, I wouldn't have any of this in my life had I not gone through the addiction. So that's the way I frame it up as well. And I totally agree. I was saying in a meeting last night, everybody in the world would be lucky to be in a 12-step program, or some kind of recovery. And I totally
some kind of
agree.
recovery.
If you're not working on yourself and admitting that you have problems, that just means you're lying about it. And I'm really grateful we have the program because it's free. We don't have to pay
Yeah.
a dime, and everybody just wants to help each other for free. It's unbelievable. And I also want to interject back to your timeline of these months you're in recovery. This is when I meet you. So I come in, June 15th was my first meeting of 2021. So you had, what, about 5.5 months or so at the time. And I remember you always had your number on the screen, and you were very charismatic, very open and warm. And then you started sharing more about the sports gambling. And you were starting to say things that I couldn't believe, because the kinds of sports gambling I was doing and how reckless I was doing it for as long as I was doing it, I really thought I was the only person in the world that was doing those things. And so that's when it had to be somewhere in that first 10 days where I got, because you listed your number, I just was like, let me just reach out to this guy. after the meeting one night, and I knew you were back east and how late it was for you. And I shot you a text, and I figured maybe he'll respond in the morning. Maybe he probably won't, because I didn't before you. I didn't hadn't reached out really to anybody in that first week or so, and you got back to me right away. And for the next couple of hours, well into the middle of the night for you, we're just going back and forth about all this sports gambling. And so I've told you this privately, but I want to say here publicly that you were that person for me, Jason, that had that connection not been established, had you not been the charismatic person you were, whether you were exactly following the GA handbook precisely, that very well may be why I felt comfortable enough that night to reach out to you. And it was because of that I started for the first time to feel like I'm not alone, you know? Um, because as you talked about your whole journey of recovery or journey of addiction in so many different ways, it all surrounds that feeling of isolation, especially as the lying and the manipulation. And we're all dying on the inside, regardless of what it may look like to others on the outside. And that's how it felt coming in. And I didn't believe it would work for me when I came into GA. I did not. I just knew it was my last ditch effort too, because my relationship was on the line. I was in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. I saw no other way out. And so I was very skeptical coming in, also not having any religion or belief in spirituality or a higher power. So that connection to you and what you gave back to me that night would bond us forever from my perspective. And we've gone obviously at this a little bit differently, especially in maybe the first couple of years. But what's really awesome for me now is like we're very much in sync today. And I think even the way we approach the program, I know you're going to a lot more meetings in person, and I think for a long time that really wasn't the case for you, right? As
I
far
didn't go
as
to an in-person meeting for the first 3 years.
yeah, you're evolving and all the people you help. So I just again want to say that that connection that we made that night and what you gave to me, you helped change a life, and I know I'm not the only one that feels that way. So I love you for that. I always will, and I'm really glad that for whatever reason I went into that same Zoom meeting. Otherwise, I may have never met you. That's how I see that.
It's one of the best things that ever happened to me. You're one of my favorite people in the universe. You're one of the most solid humans that anybody could ever meet, and I think, one of the reason we are so aligned on our views of the world and of recovery in a way that I think very few people become aligned in relationship, in marriages, in relation, like the two things that we both see, which is one, that gambling is the best thing that ever happened to us. Being an addict is the best thing that ever happened to us, which sounds like so much bullshit to everybody else when they walk into a room, right?
Right. And
You
they
know,
want to kill us for
and they
saying
want
it.
to kill us.
Right.
And like our spouses, we both have spouses who have a little trouble with that statement,
Yep.
understandably, because they had to sit through decades of hardship because of our addictions.
Yep.
But we both know we would not be the humans we are today. We would not have the chance to live the lives we want to live for the next 50, 60, 70 years, help the number of people we want to help, experience the things we want to experience. We every bit of freedom and joy we have in the world is because we went through these experiences and came out on the other side. So we are so aligned and so grateful to go through what we went through. It creates, there are just so few other people who have that experience and who have that outlook on life, and to be so aligned on something. And then the other thing we are so aligned on is that we both deeply believe that no matter what happens, we're going to be fine. And that comes from understanding that what happened with gambling, we're lucky to have gone through, that we both believe that every outcome in the world is a chance to grow and become better humans. And there are no, like, I often share this story. A lot of people in the GA universe know this, but I broke my leg last year. I was on the Burbank. I was still attending the Burbank meeting, even though I had started in-person meetings at the time. And I was frequently talking about how lucky I was to break my leg. And nobody wants to break their leg. I didn't want to break my leg, but like I was now in a hospital and I couldn't move, so I could catch up on my reading. I could had time to read, but I had no excuse. All I could finally read all the books that I had missed out on in the 20 years that I was gambling, and I could make more phone calls to people in the program when I couldn't,
Mhm.
when I was running around doing, running my business and playing golf and, going, running half marathons and whatever else, I like to do in my free time. I couldn't get down to the kitchen to snack so I could finally lose some weight because I couldn't fucking walk. I was like, there are no end. I didn't want to break my leg, but there are no end to the benefits of breaking your leg. And there was this guy who, I am friends with in the program who shared after I shared that. And he's like, I am so upset that Jason broke his leg, not because I feel badly for him, but because now I have to hear about how great it is to break your leg for the next 6 months. And all I want to do is come on here and share how annoyed I am by my boss or this person I ran into, or that I stubbed my toe and it hasn't gotten better in 3 days. And like, Jason's positivity can be really, that it's
Mm,
really annoying to listen to. But I think, you and I are both aligned in that everything is going to, if like, we don't want big calamities to happen in our life. We don't want our spouses to leave us. We don't want our parents to die. We don't want to get sick. We don't want to lose our jobs, whatever it is. But we both fundamentally know because of what we've gone through and where we are now that we're going to be fine
yeah,
and that everything's going to be fine and that everything is an opportunity to grow and make our lives better, even if it's not what we plan for in our heads when we're setting out our plans. So I am more aligned with those. Those are like the two most core values in my life. And I think they're two very core values in my life. And we are so aligned on those that whatever else is going on in our lives, I think we will always be as close of friends that have as much respect and gratitude for each other as any two people could have, at least from my perspective. You might get annoyed with me for other reasons, but from my perspective, that like we will always be deeply, deeply close and intertwined brothers because I don't believe those values will ever change. I think those are now core tenets of our life,
yeah.
gratitude and an outlook that everything will be fine if you just have the right mindset.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And I think it's really along spiritual lines too. And it's kind of funny, two guys who didn't have any of that growing up, right? And didn't have those beliefs, certainly in a religious God, and certainly for me at least, zero belief in any power beyond myself that could possibly be in existence. And like to me, the essence of spirituality now is just no matter what is going on in the outside world, I'm at peace knowing the inside it's going to be okay. It doesn't mean it's all going to be great, but it's going to be okay. And I don't need to go control all these other outside things and manipulate things on the outside to match what I think I want on the inside. And I feel like that for me is what that essence of really living a spiritual existence is all about, and why I think I have the amount of serenity I have now.
Yeah, yeah, and I say it all the time in my meetings. I still don't believe in God. I'm very much an atheist. But I am a deeply spiritual and faithful person. It has nothing to do with the supernatural or religion in any way, but I have a deep abiding faith that if I do the right things and have the right perspective and look for the opportunities instead of the reasons to complain or stew or pity, that everything will work out fine in the same way that somebody who is very religious says, as long as I put my faith in God, I'll be fine.
Right.
My faith is in self-growth and goals and making the right decisions and doing the hard work. And when I don't do those things, owning up to it, taking moral inventory, and trying to become a better human, because I'm gonna fall short, right?
Yeah.
I'm a human, I still have too healthy of an ego, I still have too many defects, and I'm gonna make mistakes every day. Some mistakes are worse than others. Some are traces and vestiges of old defects I had, and some are new things. but as long as I'm taking an inventory and trying to improve on them and discussing them with people, like that I'm going to be fine. Everything's going
Yeah.
to be fine. And,
Yeah.
and it's good to make mistakes. Making mistakes is wonderful. I used to think failure, like making mistakes was a horrible thing. And now I think like every time I mess up and there are consequences, it's feedback on how I need to grow as a human. It's an opportunity to be a better version of Jason, not just for myself, but for the people around me so they can get more joy spending with me and more joy and success from having me in their universe. It's really a wonderful place to be in life. I'm so lucky compared
Yeah.
to I was such a horrible version of myself for 34 years.
Yeah, I think gambling addiction, we all become the very worst versions of ourselves. And in recovery, we have at least a chance to become the very best version of ourselves, depending on what we do with it. I want to ask you a few like recovery related topical questions and maybe get into just some chat about that. What do you think is the reason, or one of them, why we have such a high relapse rate in the recovery space, especially in the first year that people come into the program? I mean, by my own eyes and how I've seen so many new people come in my 4+ years, it seems like it's probably 1 out of every 10 make it a year without relapse, and then people are coming in and out constantly with relapse. What are your thoughts about why that might be?
Yeah, I probably would have put the number at like 1 out of every 15, but
You could be right.
it's look, I think there are many reasons. One, we both recovery didn't work for us the first time around, right? Most people don't learn from their mistakes the first time around, and most people who walk into a recovery room, are not actually ready to give up gambling. 90% at least of the people I meet in recovery are there because they got caught doing something and are there for ulterior motives other than just for themselves and wanting to be a better version of themselves.
Mm,
They are trying to save a relationship. They're trying to appease parents. They're trying to appease siblings. They are going through some sort of legal thing that requires them to be at meetings, whatever it is. They are not there of their own accord. They have not fully committed to giving up gambling yet.
yeah.
The second thing is giving up gambling is easier for some people than others. So I am very fortunate where my wife let me stay in the house. I still had a job. I had family who I could have run to who would have supported me in some way, maybe not bailed me out, but would have given me shelter or food or something. A lot of people who come into recovery do not have as much structure around them as others. And the need for a big win, they feel the need for a big win to put food on the table or get gas in their car or get to work is even more powerful than the run of the mill addict who has
Mm,
support around them. So, are there resources to help those people? Of course, there are food banks and pressure relief programs where they help set you up, deal with your creditors and things like that. But it's just a fact of life that, some people are more privileged than other people. And people who are less privileged have more pressures on them, and more pressure when you're an addict leads to more bad decision making. And third, I think, I've spent a lot of time in recovery rooms, and when newcomers come in, the percentage of people who reach out and establish genuine connection is smaller than we need it to be.
mm,
So I did used to post my number, but I relied heavily on people reaching out to me rather than me reaching out to other people. The reason I stayed in recovery is because Guy reached out to me day after day after day,
mhm.
multiple times a day. You stayed in recovery, probably not solely this, but partially because I responded to that message and you were able to make a connection. So part of it is the recovery community is not as proactive as it needs to be on making sure newcomers feel welcome and loved. People
Do
try.
you do you think that's true in the online meetings versus in person, or do you see a different response, if you will, from somebody who comes into a room and is facing it face to face and feeling it versus they're online, maybe their camera's on, maybe it's off, maybe their name is shown, maybe it's not. Like, do you feel there's a difference between those things?
There might be a slight difference, but I see it in my in-person meetings too, that if anybody is going to reach out 8 times out of 10, it's got to be me, that other people in the rooms are not necessarily going to reach. They're very warm. Everybody in an in-person meeting is very warm when the person walks in, but a meeting lasts an hour or 2 hours a day, and there were
Right.
other 22 hours. And when people are early in recovery, it takes a lot of supervision in those 22 hours when people are not in the rooms. Not supervision, but connection and barriers. And you establish that connection earlier and you have wisdom about how to put up barriers, how to ban yourself from things, how to hand over your finances to somebody else, like whatever it is, apps that you can download. You're helping people, providing that connection and providing that wisdom in more than the 3 minutes you get when you share or interact in a meeting is essential to keep most people in the program the first time they walk in a room. Those are a couple or a
Yeah.
handful of reasons that I think we come up short. Most of it is that I don't think most people are ready when they come into a room to give up the first time, to give up gambling. There's a part of them that wants to give up gambling. They're there or they're pressured to be there, whatever it is. But most people, our brains are very good at rewiring and remembering the positives and forgetting the negatives.
Right.
And most people need to be zapped many times before they realize they're not going to reach that cheese, or
Totally.
that there's a better way to get the cheese, which is don't reach for it immediately. Save up your little mouse money, and then so you can go to the grocery store and get whatever type of cheese you want.
Yep. No, I totally agree, and in alignment too with the main issue being people still want to gamble more than they want to stop, for whatever those reasons are. Be it there's still that carrot out there that maybe I can hit it big the next time, and I
Yeah.
think that's why gambling addiction versus maybe substance abuse is just so different, because there's always that thought for the gambler: I can hit it big, I can still go after it. There's no amount, there's nothing a drug
Alcohol.
addict or an alcoholic is going to get in return other than the escapism and the numbing out from the substance, right? Where the gambler is always thinking in the back of their mind, I can still reach for the financial carrot, if you will, right? So yeah, I totally agree with that.
I just
Yeah,
thought of one more significant one,
sure.
which is most people, the first time they walk into a meeting, that's the first time they've encountered another gambling addict. Gambling addicts are still relatively low profile compared to other addicts. There are very famous alcoholics and drug
Mm-hmm.
addicts who have
Mm-hmm.
overcome things. There are
Right.
not that many famous gambling addicts.
Yep.
And so most people don't realize that there is a path out of the darkness and into the light. And in a 3 minute conversation or hearing a couple of shares, some people who have 72 hours, most people who have less than a month, and just like one or two guys or women who have a lot of time is not enough to convince them. Whereas, if we, and these exist, but if we had senators talking about their previous gambling addiction, and famous actors and famous lawyers and podcast hosts and radio hosts, if there were more success stories out in the world, people would realize there is a path out of that tunnel, and the people who know that path are in those recovery rooms. And right when they first walk into that room, they're skeptical that anybody has a story like them. And it
Right.
takes more than one meeting to convince them at this point, because there are not that many stories that are known to them.
Yeah. Great perspective. And I think that's totally true. I mean, some of those stories are out there, but you're right. They pale in comparison. And the bigger issue, which kind of leads me into my second topic with you, is the glamorizing of gambling in our society, particularly the way it is advertised and pushed to the public from the most famous people in the world, right? We see it all the time, particularly as it relates now to sports gambling, all the FanDuel, DraftKings commercials, other companies where you have the most famous of people, athletes, celebrities, talking about gambling, encouraging the behavior, as if saying to all the young people out there in particular, and that's their target audience, those the high school kids, the college kids, this is the place to be. This is the action you want to be in, right? And so, when you have all the quote unquote role models out there in the world from a celebrity perspective, I mean, that's a different issue. Role models should be parents and other people in kids' lives, but that's not the reality we live in. They look to alternative places often. And I think that's exactly back to that point is there's just not enough people out there that are talking about the dangers of it compared to the pimping up that they do on the other end. And I think until something more drastic happens as it relates to people coming at it from the other side, and or it may take some tragic situation of somebody famous having a gambling issue or gambling related situation happen to really turn the dial a little bit differently. So what I wanted to ask you, kind of on the ducktails of that, is sports gambling, which obviously was what crippled you and I in all our years of addiction. And it's certainly, I think, the fastest growing segment of the gambling addicts are now young people coming in with sports gambling because of all the things we just talked about. What's your stance as a now almost 5 years in recovery and so relatable to sports? You talked about your upbringing being a fan of all the Boston teams. How did you early in your recovery deal with the watching of sports, and how is that maybe evolved for you differently? And then what do you tell the younger people coming in when they are ravaged by all these sports triggers? How do you kind of weigh those two things about how you, Jason, deal with it versus what your advice might be to those folks?
Ooh, that was a lot. I will say that you know this, but I still watch sports. My sports watching has changed drastically. I used to watch every sporting event, no matter who played, because I had money on the game or I was studying to have money on the game. I quote unquote studying, preparing to have money on
Handicapping,
and
right?
yeah, exactly. And so, if it was 11 p.m. on a Saturday and Oregon State and Idaho were playing college football, I
Yep.
would stay up and watch that game because I probably had a lot of money on that game. And, I wanted to be prepared to bet on those teams in future weeks.
Yep.
And I never have played tennis, but I would watch a lot of tennis, like WTA tournaments going on in China at 4 in the morning. I would bet on them and watch them because they,
Yep.
even though I didn't know who they
Why
were,
not?
whatever. Yeah, because why not? I would say now I only basically have interest in my Boston sports teams. So I watch the Red Sox. My wife and I are huge Red Sox fans. I watched the Patriots part of their game last Sunday. I'll watch some Celtics. And for me, a lot of my friends and my community are still Red Sox and Celtics and Patriots and Bruins and Boston College fans. And, my wife is a huge Red Sox fan, and it's a way for us to bond. And,
Mhm.
I never think about it in terms of finances anymore, even though it's all over every fucking pitch,
Yep.
every commercial, whatever is about gambling. But I've gotten to the point in like, I live in a city, and car alarms are going off all the time, and you just learn to like tune them out. I've gotten used to tuning out the gambling talk. And so I get probably more joy now out of watching my local teams than I ever have in my entire life. Because I used to watch them with so much stress.
Mm.
I used to bet on them all the time in addition to watching them. And, if they won, I was jubilant, or they won and they didn't cover. And I watched my team, they won, and I still didn't get joy out of it.
Right.
Or, I was depressed not only because they lost, but because I lost money on it. Now I really watch for, out of a pure enjoyment perspective. And my life is unaffected whether they win or lose, right? Like as soon as the
Mhm.
game is over, I move on to other things that have more value. Or no, I shouldn't say more value, but other things that are important in my life. My list of things that is important in my life and that I have to get done, or hobbies I want to engage in, or people I talk to, is much longer than the number of hours in a day. So like I don't have time to dwell on it. Like I enjoy it while I'm in it, but then it's over, it's on to the next thing. What I tell younger people is that most people, if they are sports gamblers, or have to unplug from sports. It takes a long time for your, science. You create these neural pathways from gambling, these new neural pathways. And, some scientists say it takes 9 months, sometimes it takes 12, sometimes it's 14, whatever it is, whatever study you read,
Right.
to rewire your brain to not look for those hits. And when you're used to watching a game through the lens of lines and gambling and how much you're going to put on a pitch or how much you're going to put on a quarter or whether this guy's going to score a touchdown or whatever it is, when you're early in recovery and you still have a lot of debt and you don't have other things going on in your life and you don't have, you don't feel, you haven't bought into the belief that everything is going to be fine and you haven't found your serenity and your higher power and whatever it is,
Mhm.
those are unbelievably tempting. And it's almost impossible to watch that over and over after you've done it for so many years and not gamble. So I think people need time under their belts before they can start inching their way back into the sports viewing world. I'm sure there are people who have done it successfully right off the bat. I understand that all humans are different. I give them my best advice and don't tell them specifically. I never talk about what I do. I would tell them what I think is the best advice. What I do in year 5 might be different. And this again could be hubris, but it is different than what I would recommend to somebody who's on day 5. In terms of, the pop culture portion of it, a little related to the last thing we're talking about not having role models and the people pushing it down our throats. I think a regret I have, this, but, I was on a television show called Jeopardy, and they give you a chance to talk about yourself. There are interviews
Mhm.
in the portion of the show, and they ask you to submit a bunch of stories. Then they pick what they think are most interesting and they ask you about them as part of an interview portion of the show. One of the things I wrote was, I'm a gambling addict. I've been a gambling addict for 20 years. And I think I haven't taken the normal path to Jeopardy. I don't think there's a lot of people who were homeless or addicts for multiple decades who end up on this show. And I thought I was going to have a really long run on the show. It turned out it was only 3 episodes. But during game 3, they said, hey, would you like to talk about this addiction piece?
Mm.
In this homeless piece, as part of your interview. And I was like, my parents don't know that I was homeless or how close my marriage was to collapsing. So let me go out to dinner with them tonight and tell them, and we could talk about it during game 4. I never got to
Oh,
Never got to game 4. But that would have been a chance for somebody in front of 13 million people a night to say, hey, I'm a gambling addict and I came out on the other side. And, I'm hoping there's a very good chance I'll be back on Jeopardy for the postseason in the not too distant future, that I will get a chance to talk about it on national television.
mm.
And, not that I'm important or that 13 million people is a lot or doing it on Jeopardy is like a big platform. I just think normalizing people talking about gambling addiction is really important. So I hope in the future I get that opportunity. And, I hope others in the future take that opportunity. Obviously, we've already seen it affecting culture. The Cleveland Indians, their 2 best pitchers, are suspended
Yep.
because of gambling accusations. There are a few NBA players who are under investigation because of gambling. So I hope down the road, those people are going to fight it tooth and nail while they're in it because nobody likes getting caught and nobody owns up to it the first time. But
Mhm.
I hope down the road, as more and more athletes and politicians and businessmen make these mistakes and get bitten by this disease, because it's non-discriminatory, it doesn't matter if you're rich or black, white, young, old, it affects everybody, man, woman, that more and more people get an opportunity to tell them stories on their long stage, and that will help reduce the stigma and also show that there's a pathway to go from being as deep down in the addiction as possible to living in the sunlight and living with serenity. There's a pathway to go from being unsuccessful or homeless to being more than somewhat successful and interesting and a contributing member of the world. And we know those millions of those stories exist. We hear
Right.
about them in the rooms every day, but we have not gotten used to telling those stories in public in the way we need to, which is one of the reasons that this podcast is such a wonderful endeavor. One of many reasons. I think people just need to hear your story. You personally are a very charismatic and wonderful messenger for the program, but it's hopefully just one of many podcasts where these stories will be told going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's just such a great story that both you and Susan are Jeopardy champions, and I would love to be in the audience, especially if you're going to be able to talk about the gambling stuff. That's amazing, and yeah, that will reach millions of people. And I think just the fact that you have it in your mind that you'd be willing to go out on that ledge and talk openly about it. That's a testament to your almost 5 years now and all the work that you've done on yourself and just the total life transformation that you made. I mean, you're the epitome example of what people coming into recovery who have all these doubts about where they've been and what they've done and can something like this work for them. And you and I and many others are out there as real life examples of people that have lived it for years and years. We're as broken of human beings as you could possibly be in all facets of our life. And in just a few years period of time, complete life transformation on so many different levels. Still acknowledging not all parts of life are always great all the time, right?
Yeah, yeah, we're still gonna fuck up all the time. But like,
Yeah,
I think what's important is that, the emphasis on broken individuality. I think often when we talk about gambling, we talk about broke in terms of finances, but gambling is not the problem. You hear this in rooms all the time. It's a symptom of other problems. We are broken people. All humans are broken, but we are broken people who are looking for solutions in the wrong place and didn't know how to deal with our shortcomings. And what recovery gives you is a pathway to becoming happier, healthier humans. The money and getting out of debt comes with that, but it's really just like gambling is a symptom, financial or job success is a symptom of being a healthier, happier human.
yep, no question about it. And I know you sponsor a number of people, right? Like, what's that experience like for you? How's that been going in your recovery?
I love sponsoring people. I think both you and I, another thing we share in common is that we started sponsoring people fairly quickly in our journeys compared to what other people would say without even finishing all the steps. Because I think we talked about this for when people come into the rooms, why don't they stay? I think connecting with people who your story will resonate with and your personality will resonate with has a chance to save other people. And even if you have not completed the program by the program's letter of the law, we still have a lot of value to offer other people in one-on-one scenarios that we can't offer them in group settings, and have value to offer them as sponsors specifically, because anytime somebody connects with you can be a rare thing for a newcomer. So if you're the person they connect with and you can help walk them through the steps, however imperfectly that may be,
Right.
it's still better than not working the steps, and it's still better than not having a sponsor. And so I think, one of the ways we've come more aligned on the program is that that's very important. Sponsorship, I think you probably can attest to this, and every sponsor can be a frustrating thing. Most people don't listen to all the wisdom that you think you have, and don't do all of the things that you want them to, but also can be like one of the most rewarding things in the world. One of my sponsees started a really wonderful anti-gambling application app called Alchemist One that has literally helped thousands and thousands of people. It involves journaling, it involves physical activity, it involves meditating, it involves spending time with yourself, it involves therapy, it involves all sorts of things that are important to recovery. I'm lucky to be a part of that company and that program because my sponsee started it, and because we connected and we got him to a place where he can be a better version of himself. And I have sponsees who have gone out and are not doing great. But I think on the whole, when you sponsor people and you're committed to their well-being, they have a higher hit rate of success than if you left them out there without anybody reaching out to them and trying to connect with them and help them along. Or if you said no to them for whatever reason. And sometimes I say no to people who
Yep.
ask, like, I'm at a point in my life where I am incredibly busy. Sometimes I have to say no because I don't feel like I have the time or the bandwidth to devote to the person to be a functional sponsor, and that's something I really struggle with. Even with my current
Mm,
sponsees, like, am I giving as much as I should give? There are doubts that come with it, and there are frustrations that come with it. But overall, it's one of the few times in my life I've ever given back. I've talked about being a selfish, narcissistic, self-centered person my entire life when I was in active addiction. So just the fact that anybody it thinks I can offer anything into their life, and the fact that I want to spend time giving back in some way is, a mini miracle in and of itself. And hopefully it's true that I do more good than harm for those people.
Yeah, and I love what you said in the beginning about, the steps and sponsoring. And it's interesting. I remember early on when I was starting to talk about maybe becoming a sponsor for the first time. And I can't, maybe I had 6 months. I didn't have a lot of time, but I had started working on the steps. Maybe I was on step 3 or something. And I had a longtime member after a meeting, who kind of was listening to what I was saying. And he's like, he said, you haven't been through the steps yet, have you? And I said, well, I'm on step, I think it was 3 at the time. And he's like, well, I really don't think you should be sponsoring people until you've gone completely through the steps. And this was somebody with a lot of years, and it kind of shook me because I was like, well, he's somebody I respect. He clearly, has changed his life, and I probably should consider what he's saying. But what I really realized and came to the conclusion of is that, and maybe it's just different today because the demographic of who's coming into the GA rooms is just different than it was before. And there's a lot more younger people. And I think how we connect and resonate to people might be different than the way this individual went through it many, many years ago, maybe with his sponsor, that kind of thing. And so my motto has kind of always been, as long as you're ahead of the person you're sponsoring in steps, then you can help guide them through the steps that they're on, right?
Yeah,
And
definitely
more
agree.
importantly than that, for me, what I've learned is that there's so much more reason to be a sponsor than just guiding somebody through the steps, mostly around what you mentioned about the connectivity to another human being. And I can honestly say for each guy that I sponsor, I can call them close friends, and I know the inner workings of their lives and the people in their lives very, very well. And they know that about me. When people want you to be a part of the most important things in their lives, that's when you're in the right place doing the right thing. And so I'm glad you shared all of that. And it's awesome what you're doing with your sponsees. And I agree too. I've said no to other people because sometimes you don't have maybe the instinct that you can help everybody. And I've gotten to that point where I know there's certain people I can't help for a number of different reasons. And I don't have the ego that I used to have thinking, oh, anything I can say or influence, I can help somebody. It's just not true. You can only help so many people. I believe everybody has the ability to help somebody. And I do wish we had more people, especially with time, be available to be sponsors because I do think it's lacking a lot in our fellowship. And so I hope that changes, especially as we have continued increased attendance across the rooms and for younger people who badly need that guidance and help. So I hope that becomes a more prevalent thing along the lines of what you and I are talking about and how we've approached it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes along with like the reaching out. Like, there's sometimes a lack in the rooms of willingness to make a connection and to spend your own time helping others. Sometimes we think attending meetings is enough, and sharing at meetings is enough, and really we need everybody on board to help as many people as possible because the number of people who are willing to help versus the number of people who need help, there's a major disparity in the numbers there, and the number of people who need help far outweighs the number of people who are willing to offer help. I have so many other things I want to talk to you about. Maybe one day we'll get to do this again.
We can do part 2. One final question before I let you go, Jason.
Yeah.
So, what do you tell all these new people that are struggling out there, whether they're on day one, they're coming into the rooms, maybe they're afraid to come into the rooms and they're still in the addiction. They just don't see any other way to live their life without gambling in it. What's your messaging to those individuals?
I think a lot of the precepts of the program are true. And whether you believe them or not on day one, I would ask you to give them 30 days and try it out. So, like, meetings to me make it. They make it for 3 reasons. I mean, they make it for 100 reasons, but there are 3 reasons to me that they are essential. One is that you get to hear other people who come in at day zero, or have relapsed on day zero and are reminded in their pain and their stories how insidious and destructive this disease is. And sometimes when you see other people going through it and hear their stories and hear that they're doing the same crazy things as you, but there's some distance there because they're doing it and not you, it's a stark reminder of how effed up the behavior is. And how nonsensical it is and how much destruction it's causing. The second reason is you get to hear people like you, Eric, and the tens of thousands of other people in the program who have a lot of time under their belts and who have gone on to do really amazing things like start podcasts and win on game shows and become script writers and win Oscars and start law firms and start startups that help, that fight against gambling. There's so many people in the room with such interesting stories who have gone out of the darkness and turned their life around and turned, into something really, really interesting. It's a necessary reminder of how good things can get, no matter how bad things were. And the third reason I think meetings make it is that it's the only place where you will get unconditional love. It's not that parents don't love you, or spouses don't love you, or friends don't love you, or siblings don't love you, but the people who are not addicts only have so much love they can give and can only take so much scar tissue and pain before they have to back away and protect themselves. But the people in the rooms, the people who are in recovery, know that whether you've relapsed 10 times or 20 times or 50 times, no matter what crimes you've committed or how much money you've lost or how many stupid mistakes, your jobs or relationships you've torpedoed, that when the light clicks, you can become a better version of yourself, a more interesting version of yourself, a version that everybody in your community can respect and love, and you add value to their lives and their world. And I just think the only place you can find that unconditional love is in the rooms. I very rarely meet somebody who's not an addict who practices unconditional love. It doesn't mean that you like everybody,
Right.
but the few people, and I think like the biggest difference between, there's so many differences between me as an active addict and me in recovery. But one of the fundamental differences is I was a misanthrope who didn't like and didn't love anybody. And now I fundamentally love everybody. It doesn't mean I want to spend time with all of them, but I think it doesn't, it means it, I do believe that every person is essentially good. Nobody is born bad. Nobody wants to be stupid. Nobody wants to be socially awkward. Nobody wants to be an addict. Nobody wants to be a criminal, but they're born into circumstances that lead them down those paths. But every person as a kid wants to be fundamentally good and fundamentally happy and fundamentally successful.
Yeah.
And it's my job as a human being who understands that to heap love on that person and try to help them get closer to that person they want to be by sharing my vulnerabilities and letting them know that their vulnerabilities are okay. And I really think you only find that unconditional love in meetings. So I ask people, regardless of how they feel about meetings or where they're at in their life, if there are other people like them, to give me 30 days, come to my meetings, meet other people in the program, go to any meetings, make connections, hear people, listen to their stories, be actively engaged in the meeting, listening and sharing. And I think within 30 days, you will see that a life in recovery, whether it's in a 12-step program or not, is better than a life outside of recovery where apathy and complacency, there was a football coach here in New England who, Bill Belichick, who used to have a saying that nobody stays the same. You're either getting worse or you're getting better every day. And if you're out there and you're not actively working on yourself, you're getting worse every day. And if you're in recovery, getting better every day. If you're working on yourself and you're seeking out ways to better yourself from people who have wisdom, things 100% of the time get better. Very few people take that advice. I've never seen it not work for people. I would give them that spiel, that very long spiel that ran over my 3 or 4 or 5 minutes that I'm allowed in a meeting. And I guess this is why nobody likes me in their meetings. I would say, trust me, I'm speaking from the heart. Or if you don't trust me, just give it a try, because what do you have to lose?
Yeah, that was beautifully said. Well, Jace, thanks so much for coming on and doing this. It's been a long time coming, and I love doing it. I loved learning some things I hadn't heard before. It's really special to have been there, you be there for my day one, and it be your early recovery, and to go through what we've gone through, and to be where we are now and as close as we are, and experiencing so much gratification in life with all the people around us that we've been fortunate enough to have in our lives is a total miracle. Keep doing what you're doing, keep helping all the people you're helping. You are a beacon of hope and light to so many people. I never met your brother. I wasn't there when all that was going on, but I would have to say that he's looking down on you now with an extraordinary amount of pride for what you're doing for the world. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you for saying that. I think, one of the many great gifts the program has given me is that even though I lost a brother, one, I have a fundamental greatness and the ability, gratefulness that he existed in the world and the ability to try to carry on his spirit. But two, I've gained so many more brothers because of this program, so much more family than I ever had. I consider you one of my closest brothers, somebody who is unquestionably family in my life. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you for being there for me. Thank you for being there for other gamblers. And I hope this is the first of many conversations we have on this platform and all the others where we get to discuss recovery and life and all of the joys that are in the world and all of the mistakes that we make and how we can learn from them.
Love it. Thanks, brother. Love you. Thanks for doing this. For anyone that has a question, either for me or if something you want to ask Jason, you can, as always, email the show, eric@thegamblingrecoverylounge.com. We'll always, as usual, post that in the recap of the show notes. But this has been experience number 21 with Jason and the Gambling Recovery Lounge. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Have a great night. We'll see you next time.